Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillah ahlihi wa salatu ala ahliha. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. We are now coming to the close of the fourth annual Ahlul Bayt Forum, and we had a progression of trying to decide whether we can know the Prophet, whether we need to, and how we can defend the Prophet, and then what are some aspects of the legacy of the Prophet that we might need to appreciate in a way that we were not aware of before. And of course, we want to bring the session to a close by giving ourselves a little bit of homework, something that we want to think about and engage in further contemplation and reflection. And so I want to begin with a couple of questions about our Muslim communities. I'm going to take for granted that most of us, either in practice or on a conceptual level, appreciate the need to constantly be in touch with the Quran and with the Quranic message. That's something that, inshallah, is a baseline for Muslims. Many of us are very careful to read the Quran regularly, especially in the month of Ramadan. And sometimes if we still aspire to do better than we have in the past, we see that as being important. How often do most of us feel a need to regularly study and engage with the biography and the life and the seerah of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wa alihi? It's often not something that we put on the radar in the same way. And some Muslims, we may have an explanation for it. We say that when we read the Quran is talking about the life of the Prophet. It's describing the struggles and the sacrifices and the battles and the commandments and the theology and the totality of the teachings of the Prophet. And so in appreciating the Quran, we are also connecting with the Prophet. But that understanding is not really so far from Hasbuna Kitabullah, that the book of Allah is sufficient for us. Because those who say that the book of Allah is sufficient for us, they're not denying that the book of Allah has to be seen as a commentary on the teaching and the life of the Prophet. What they are denying is that we have to have an independent appreciation and a sense of humility towards the life of the Prophet on its own terms in order to be able to understand the Quran better, just as the Quran is going to be one of the ways in which we learn about the Prophet. And that is something that Imams of Ahlul Bayt ﷺ wasalam emphasized. When Amir al-Mu'mineen sent Abdullah ibn Abbas to debate with the Khawarij were people who used to read the Quran regularly and often very beautifully. In many cases, they had the Quran memorized. And Imam Ali said, don't use the Quran with them, because the Quran can easily be abused. And it has been abused, and the Quran itself says, as we explored very briefly in the previous session, that for people who are not looking for hidayah, the Quran is easy to misuse or misconstrue or misunderstand. Amir al-Mu'mineen said one of the solutions to that is to begin by talking about the practice of the Prophet. If you know the Prophet and you are intimate with the Prophet, the Quran will make more sense. Just as the Quran is going to be one of the ways in which you will acquire that intimacy with the Prophet. So that is what I would like to do in the few moments that we have together, to try to give us motivation and some ways to think about how to connect to the Prophet. Now, the topic, diplomacy and dynamism, I just chose dynamism for the alliteration. It's more vitality of the message of the Prophet. It's diplomacy. Now, what is diplomacy? If we were to phrase that within the language of ahadith and Islam, what word would we use within our tradition, within ahadith, within the teachings of Ahlul Bayt? How would you describe diplomacy? Some people would say it's nifaq, munafaqa, right? It's hypocrisy. We don't like it, and we don't generally do it very well. What term would fit well for diplomacy? The term we choose might make us appreciate better or worse whether the Prophet was or was not diplomatic or a diplomat, and what part of the Prophet's message was engaged in diplomacy. Any suggestions for? Mudarat is one term that might not be familiar to all of you. Mudarat basically refers to try to interact with people in a positive and in an amicable way, a way that reduces tension. That is one term. Now, some of you may have heard that term. If you studied ahadith, especially ahadith about akhlaq, you will have come across the term mudarat. Anything broader? Tactfulness, yes, al-tactfulness, to make it Arabic. What part of the term that I would like us to think of as diplomacy is taqiyya. Right? Taqiyya often gets a bad rap. And it's an accusation that nowadays you actually find many non-Muslims using. Islam is the religion of taqiyya. I'm sure many Shias are going to be looked at with quite a bit of hostility by Sunnis, that this is your fault, that non-Muslims use taqiyya as a weapon against Islam. But actually it's a badge that we should wear with pride. Yes, Islam is the religion of taqiyya. And the teachings of Ahlul Bayt emphasize the importance of taqiyya. But taqiyya is not lying. It's not even dissimulation. It is diplomacy. And mudarat is one of the important components of taqiyya. At-taqiyya bil-mudarat. So let's begin and look at just a couple examples from the seerah of the Prophet's diplomacy. Notice the way that the Prophet debates with people who are questioning Tawheed. I don't know if those of you on this side can see the verse, but in Surah Saba we have that question, قُلْ مَنْ يَرْزُقُكُمْ مِنَ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ. So people are questioning Tawheed. And the Prophet is saying, who is it that brings you sustenance from the heavens and the earth? And then the Prophet is told to say, قُلِ اللَّهِ. It is God. And then the manner of debate is going to be, after you tell them the answer and give them that food for thought, وَإِنَّا أَوْ إِيَّاكُمْ لَعَلَى هُدًى أَوْ فِي ضَلَالٍ مُبِينٍ. Either we are rightly guided or you are. Either we are in manifest error or you are. Now take a look at, in many cases, how we are unable within our families. If you have a Shi'i who is a very committed Shi'i and a Sunni who is a very committed Sunni, will we often be able to maintain that kind of an etiquette, even within our own family of Islam? But this is the way that the Quran teaches the Prophet to discuss not something that is a detail of theology or a detail of law or who you do taqleed to, but a matter as fundamental as the existence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the creator of heavens and earth. We have the example of Abdullah ibn Ubay. Many of you may have heard of Abdullah ibn Ubay, the head of the Khazraj at one time. He was about to be crowned king of Medina, and then the Prophet came, and all of a sudden that whole crown and the dynasty, it became a mirage. And he was also the head of the Munafiqeen, Surah Al-Munafiqeen, and specifically that statement that they say that when we go back to Medina, we're going to kick out the Prophet and his companions. They're dhalil, and we are aziz. They're lowly, and we're strong. A person who actually said that and tried to do that, and was engaged in many conspiracies in the time of the Prophet. The Prophet stood over his body when he died and acted in a way that gave people the impression that he was praying for forgiveness for Abdullah ibn Ubay. This was somebody whose own son, Abdullah, it was Abdullah ibn Abdullah, was a very sincere Muslim. And he came to the Prophet sometimes and said that, Ya Rasulullah, if you give me the command, then I will fight and I will even be willing to assassinate my father. The Prophet said, no, that is not my way. Other companions of the Prophet, They came to the Prophet, one very famous companion, and said, Ya Rasulullah, just give me the command, or even if you don't give me the command, turn the other cheek and I will go and I will put this person's life, I will end this person's life. And that became one means for the entire conspiracy of the munafiqeen to almost be buried with the burial of Abdullah ibn Ubay, that diplomacy of the Prophet. And of course, there is a hadith. Now, these are hadith that I'm about to mention. They are somewhat questionable from the perspective of the teachings of Ahlul Bayt, but they are found in the most authentic sources in Bukhari and in Muslim within the Sunni world, and that's why I think it's important for us to mention them, even if we may have some reservations about part of the content. And the reason for that is that this understanding or these examples of the diplomacy of the Prophet, they are found within all of the sources that different Muslim schools of thought have. And this is that the Prophet is reported to have told his wife Aisha that, you know, my community, your community, are recently converted from shirk and kufr into Islam. And so because of that, there's some changes that I would make to the construction of the Kaaba. I would take these treasures that are inside the Kaaba and I would sell them and I would use it for the furtherance of my mission. But because they used to be mushrik, I will not do so. So there is a way that the Prophet is saying that something is right. It's something that I should do, but I am not going to do it because it is not diplomatic. It is not something that is advisable. So the Prophet was a diplomat. Why was that diplomacy, or that taqiyya in particular? And taqiyya is the concept that I'm going to be focusing on because I want to keep a somewhat focused discourse. That's the term that's been used and emphasized in the teachings of Ahlul Bayt alayhimu salatu wassalam. One hadith tells us, and this is from Imam Baqir alayhi salatu wassalam, that taqiyya was legislated, and I won't read the Arabic, it's legislated to protect people's life and livelihood. And so if that exercise of diplomacy might cause loss of life, then it doesn't have a place within Islam. And another act of, or other reason for diplomacy is that it is to maintain the reputation of Ahlul Bayt. Should Muslims be image conscious? Well, Imam Ja'far Sadiq says, إِيَّاكُمْ أَن تَعْمَلُوا عَمَلًا يُعَيِّرُونَ بِهِ. Don't do anything that people will insult you, but then they will come and they will insult us. Be conscious of the image of your religion and the image of Ahlul Bayt alayhimu salatu wassalam. And so the Imam, he explains that these are some of the reasons why we have that exercise of diplomacy. In tafsir, we have numerous ahadith that say that the exercise of diplomacy is not a weakness of faith. It's not because, well, you're a questionable Muslim and therefore you're going to be diplomatic. A true believer is somebody who goes and says everything directly, calls them as they see them. There were some companions of the Prophet who were like that. Right? You are familiar with the hadith of the Prophet that Abu Dhar is the most honest man under the sun. That is a hadith that is reported in Shi'i and in Sunni sources. And it is a word of praise for Abu Dhar. But is Abu Dhar the most highly praised companion of the Prophet among the ahadith of Ahlul Bayt? He certainly was the most honest and sincere. But there were others who were sometimes praised in certain contexts more highly. There actually is a hadith from Imam Baqir that says, Mitham at-Tammar. All of you are familiar with that heroic story of sacrifice and struggle, where Imam Baqir said, why didn't Mitham do taqiyya? Didn't he know the verses that were revealed about Ammar ibn Yasir? Almost indicating not that Mitham was not heroic. There is that heroism. But saying that you sometimes get more reward and you deepen your understanding of Islam by being able to hold your tongue or express yourself in a particular way. That is, in fact, why we are taught that Abu Talib has the greatest reward of any of the Muslims of his time, because he held his tongue and he acted with wisdom. So what are some examples of taqiyya? Right? This is basically something that I want to just introduce kind of briefly so that we can see that taqiyya is broader than dissimulation, than concealing, than just trying to protect ourselves. Imam Ja'far Sadiq says that at-taqiyyatu min dinillah. Taqiyya is part of God's religion. And then the companion, Ali ibn Abi Hamza in this case, says that min dinillah? Really, it's that important? And kind of does not buy it, or is a little bit shocked at that emphasis. And then the Imam gives two examples of taqiyya. And these are examples that are not always necessarily even mudarat, although in one analysis we'll return it to that concept. But they're certainly not about protecting one's life. The Imam gives two examples to prove that taqiyya is part of God's religion. One, he says that in Surah Yusuf, when Yusuf alayhi salam kind of schemed against his brothers, and then he had an announcer call out that أَيَّتُهَا الْعِيرِ إِنَّكُمْ لَسَارِقُونَ, O camel riders, you're thieves. But they had not stolen anything then. Now, ahadith and tafsir give various explanations of why Yusuf, as a prophet who would not lie, called them or had them called thieves. But the Imam says that this is an example of taqiyya. And then the other example that the Imam mentions is when Ibrahim alayhi salatu wasalam was kind of pressured by his people to join them in their polytheistic festival. And Ibrahim نظر نظرة في النجوم فقال إني سقيم. He said that I'm sick. And the hadith say that he wasn't sick. So there's explanations about what kind of a metaphor it was or why he used that term, but the Imam says this is taqiyya. So taqiyya is used by the prophets in order to be able to convey a spiritual message, in order to be able to make people understand something. It is something that has to do not just with protecting me when I'm in danger, not with trying to simply remove someone's evil from me, but in gradually bringing others who might not be receptive to guidance, like the people of Ibrahim, or like the brothers of Yusuf, and slowly make them more receptive towards a message of guidance. So how are we to perform taqiyya? Right? The Imams gave some examples. Those were from the Prophet. There was a companion of Imam Ja'far Sadiq. He came to the Imam. The Imam said, I imagine that if somebody were to insult Amir al-Mu'mineen in your presence, that the term the Imam uses is that you would probably take your mouth and you would bite off that person's nose. That's kind of a very severe insult. And if we were Orientalists, we'd say that in Arab culture, it's kind of like showing the bottom of your shoe. Right? It's a severe insult. And Abdullah ibn Miskan is proud of it. He says that, yes, me and my family, even my kids, we would all do that. And the Imam says that, you know what, sometimes I'm in the masjid of Medina, and I'm praying, and I hear somebody bad-mouthing Imam Ali. And there's only between me and that person a pillar of the masjid. So I hide behind that pillar until I complete my prayer, and then I pass by that person, and I say salam to that person, and I shake that person's hand. I hid so that they wouldn't even know that I heard it, because if I heard it and I didn't respond, that might be support. So the Imam says that this is the extent to which taqiyya is to be performed. This hadith is, although it's in Mahasin, but it's a hadith that has a generally well-regarded sanad. And then I will skip the next hadith in the interests of time. So now what is the reason behind taqiyya? Or what is the benefit of viewing the life of the Prophet through that prism of diplomacy and taqiyya with this broader understanding of our human relations and of trying to convey our interactions and use words that are going to make us a positive influence to bring people closer towards guidance? One of the main things is that it makes the life of the Prophet so much more interesting. It makes the life of the Prophet so much more captivating for us, because just like we know that the Quran is a book that has been revealed from on high, and it has encapsulated a transcendent message in human language. And so every time you read the Quran, you're going to find something new, and nobody can write a comprehensive or conclusive tafsir of Quran. Nobody can say that, well, I've finished this project, my tafsir is going to be the tafsir to end all tafsirs, now you guys work on something else, I've done this. The same thing applies to the seerah of the Prophet. And that not only makes us more interested in studying it, but it also gives us a great deal of agency. It allows us to see new dimensions in the teachings of the Prophet. Sometimes it might be the legal commandment of the Prophet that will be relevant to us and meaningful for us. Sometimes the legal ruling of the Prophet might not make sense for us. Now, we may have to submit to it, or we may have to find out if that ruling applies to us or doesn't apply to us. That's a separate process. But sometimes I hear a ruling of Islam and it clicks. And sometimes I hear a ruling of Islam and it doesn't click. Regardless of whether I submit or I don't submit, there might be another aspect of that same story or that same incident or that same ruling that will be directly speaking to me and insightful for me. And it's when we forget that we sometimes get disconnected. So we find that within the seerah of the Prophet, many times we view it in a static way. We are trying to find what is the right answer. What is the right date of a particular event? What is the right interpretation of a particular event? What is the right meaning of a particular part of the Prophet's life? And the Prophet's seerah, especially if we view it as the Prophet's exercise of diplomacy, we will be able to see it as something that gives us a great deal of agency. It means that we won't have to let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Many of the debates that we have within our communities, they are because of that. It's between something that is good and something that is better. And we make them the enemy of one another and enter into a negative competition rather than a positive connotation. Just to give one example. Right? The Prophet says that man qutila duna malihi fahuwa bimanzilati ash-shahid. And in other ahadith, fahuwa shahid. A person who sees that their property is being stolen and taken from them and fights for that property and is killed. That person is equal to a shaheed or is a shaheed, a martyr. Is there anything that a Muslim aspires to above martyrdom? A martyr's death is the best death. And then somebody asked the Prophet, so Ya Rasulullah, what would you do? Would you fight or would you not fight? The Prophet says, if it were me, I wouldn't fight. I would let the property go. The property is not worth giving my life for. Now, that's not a universal principle. In some cases, it might be worth fighting for and giving your life for or sacrificing for. But what the Prophet wants us to understand is that not every religious question, moral question, or even legal question is a matter of, give me my marching orders. Not every Muslim who is just a trooper is a good Muslim. Sometimes a Muslim who has that tension and that uncertainty is going to better appreciate the teachings and the message of the Prophet. There's another example from a question that was asked. I believe the question was asked of Imam Baqir alayhi salam, that there are two men in Kufa, and the governor at that time, or the judge, commanded them to dissociate from Imam Ali. So one of them did so. Bari'tu min Abi Turab. And the other person refused. The Imam said that the person who dissociated from Imam Ali, that person is rajulun faqihun fi dineh. That person is a faqih. But the person who refused and allowed him or herself to be put to death, rajulun ta'ajjala ila al-jannah. That person rushed towards paradise. Which of them was wrong? You're rushing to paradise, you're going to Jannah. Are you wrong? Rajulun faqihun fi dineh. So that is the beauty then of the agency that we are given by appreciating how and when the Imams want us to exercise diplomacy. And in our lives, it's not always going to be an extreme case like this, inshallah. May Allah never put us in a situation where we have to make that difficult choice. But this is also something that is very relevant to the Quran. And this is one of the beauties of the ahadith of Ahlul Bayt, something that's often underappreciated because we are looking at the Quran through other people's lenses and not through our lenses. There's a very beautiful hadith from Imam Ja'far Sadiq alayhi salatu wasalam. He says that if the Quran, whenever a verse was revealed about one person, and then that person died, if that verse were also to die or become irrelevant, then eventually all of the situations about which the Quran revealed certain verses or certain verses were revealed in the Quran, all of them would come to an end. All of those people would die. And then, mat al-kitab, the book would have died. But the Quran, lakinnahu hayyun. The Quran is alive. Just like a human being is alive, you're constantly growing and developing and changing and adapting. Lakinnahu hayyun. The Quran is alive. Yajri fi man baqi kama jara fi man mada. The Quran continues. So if you've ever wondered why is the Quran not a chronological book? Non-Muslims have sometimes said it's a frustrating book. Muslims sometimes say it's a frustrating book. Some of you have studied Ulumul Quran. What was the first revelation revealed to the Prophet? Surah Al-Fatiha? Surah Al-Alaq? What? Iqra' bismi rabbika al-akram? That was before Surah Al-Fatiha or after Surah Al-Fatiha? Where was Surah Al-Mudaththir? Do we have one opinion in the Muslim world? No. Do we have one opinion among the Shia? No. Right? That chronology was not something that was emphasized by Ahlul Bayt. And there's a reason for it. Because when you have a chronology, it kind of puts you into thinking in terms of what came first, what came later, what supersedes in a historical way. It's a big part of tafsir to talk about sha'nun nuzul, the occasions of revelation. But sometimes, and sometimes very frustratingly, in the ahadith of Ahlul Bayt, they don't talk about sha'nun nuzul. There's a hadith, or there's a verse of Quran that was clearly revealed about something in the lifetime of the Prophet, an incident with the Jews or with the Christians or within the Muslim community. And the Imams would say, this is about Imam Ali and his lovers, this is about Ahlul Bayt and their Shia. And we sometimes look at it and we say, well, that doesn't seem to fit the history. But there is something deeper than just the chronology. And sometimes verses were revealed because God wanted to give a message at one time. But the truer ta'wil of that verse was to come later. That was an excuse for the verse to be revealed and the message to be there. But the Imams would explain that the deeper meaning of that verse is not going to be understood by looking at when it was revealed, but at looking at some of the future events. Let me just give a few examples from the Quran. In Surah Al-Takwir, you're all familiar with وَإِذَا الْمَوْءُودَةُ سُئِلَتْ بِأَيِّ ذَنْبٍ قُتِلَتْ. When the female infant buried alive is asked, by what sin was she killed? Now, why is that important? Does that happen today? Not in the same form, thankfully. And even in the time of the Prophet, it was probably very, very rare. Those of you who think the Arabs used to bury their daughters alive, probably not. It's probably very rare. Now, we have a hadith where that is explained as إِذَا الْمَوَدَّةُ سُئِلَتْ بِأَيِّ ذَنْبٍ قُتِلَتْ. When mawadda in Arabic, if you look at it, it's very similar to maw'uda. When the love is asked, why was it killed? Before it was able to grow and flourish. And that is explained in numerous ahadith as being the love of Ahlul Bayt. Now, is that a question of changing the text of the Quran? Or is that example of Ahlul Bayt saying that maw'udatu is a historical example? And yes, as sha'nun nuzul or as a historical example, it's relevant. It should be there in your tafsir. That this did sometimes occur and female infanticide was condemned by the Quran. However, the reason why that is such a grave crime is that Allah gave you that daughter. That daughter didn't just come from a stork or from some coincidence. And without knowing what blessing that daughter would bring you, if you are going to turn your back on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His favor and bury that daughter, then that is a grave crime. How similar is that to mawadda of Ahlul Bayt? That you have been given a favor by Allah that is greater than any favor, a son or a daughter, or anything that we can be given in our lives. And the ummah will be asked that what did you do with that mawadda? So what the imams are doing is not saying that we're changing the text of the Quran, but they're explaining that sometimes when you think of sha'nun nuzul, you lose the deeper moral significance. And then the seerah of the Prophet or the reading of the Quran, it becomes ritualistic and it becomes boring. There's many other examples. One I have here in the slide, but I'm out of time, and it would be very unfair for us to ask our other guests to be punctual with time and to make them end on time and then not to do so ourselves. But one last example I want to give you. When the Quran says to the Jews, يا أيها الذين هادوا إن زعمتم أنكم أولياء لله من دون الناس فتمنوا الموت إن كنتم صادقين. Right? Many Muslims are uncomfortable with that. How can we talk to the Jews like that? And so what we've done is we've said that, okay, we're not going to say the Jews are bad, we'll say the Zionists are bad. Right? And many Jews, they know that Zionist is just a euphemism that Muslims use for Jews. Right? And sometimes that's the case. Now what I want to say is that if we understand this principle, which we found in the Quran here, it's very fair for us to say that yes, the Quran, when it says Ya ayyuhal ladhina hadu, it's not speaking of a label. It's speaking of in za'amtum annakum awliya'u lillahi min dunin nas. If you think you're special and the law doesn't apply to you, if you believe in exceptionalism, this verse is talking about you. Now I'm not going to, and it's lucky that I'm out of time, because you will understand who believes in exceptionalism and who the Quran is condemning. So the text is there, but the text is there to give us a means to root our understanding. And when we understand it, then we realize that that is a very living and a very meaningful text for us to derive inspiration from. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.